Well, I think it's about time for another worst to best, and this one is probably the easiest one I've had to do. When I first thought about doing these worst to best albums, this was the first band that I really wanted to tackle. Genesis, as you guys should know, is my all-time favorite band. These were the albums that really got me into progressive rock, and it changed my life, essentially. Let's go through and count down their worst to best. So let's start off with their worst album. Okay, so I know I'm going to get a little bit of flack for this, but really Abacab for me is their worst album. I've already explained why. You can check that out up here. I did a full Falling from Grace series from that. I'm not doing any more of those. What they were doing in the 80s, I didn't quite know. Like, they were really trying to balance the very accessible, poppy. Yeah, it just didn't work for me. There's no salvageable moment on this album as well, and I think that particular piece is why this is on the worst slot. All other Genesis albums at least have a few saving graces, like a few songs or moments where I'm like, okay, that was really good. I really enjoyed that song. This is the only one where not a single song is a saving grace. Like Sarah Jane might be the only one where I'm lukewarm to, but all the other ones, I've got nothing. Calling all stations. So this is the album most people would put as the worst. I can see why. I don't dispute that. It definitely holds some of their worst material, but I wouldn't put it at the worst. And here's why. I mean, Phil Collins had left the band. It was really at this point from the original team, Michael Rutherford and Tony Banks. And a lot of people were like, well, can you really carry on the Genesis legacy if there's only two of you guys? Like, you went from 5 down to 4, down to 3, and now you're only 2. And so yeah, a lot of these songs are really unlistenable. Shipwreck, Alien Afternoon, Not Above Us, Uncertain Weather. Like, these guys are very forgettable. I forgot most of these songs were out, but there are 2 moments on this album that are saving graces. The title track of Calling All Stations, as well as the Dividing Line. These 2 tracks are actually enjoyable. I thoroughly enjoy these guys. Calling All Stations, quirky as it may be, is still a really interesting song. I like how prominent the guitar works are. Like, we hadn't really heard this kind of a darker approach since, like, maybe And Then There Were 3. And same with the Dividing Line, had that same really groovin' essence that, say, was found within Duke or some parts of Invisible Touch. So bringing those guys back and really having that really hard-hitting groove, it provided a little bit more enjoyment. It provided a little bit more life on this album. That's about it. The rest of this album is definitely a throwaway. So, We Cant Dance, one of the more popular albums from the group. This album isn't a complete write-off. There are a number of moments on this album that I really kind of enjoyed. I Can't Dance being one that I really enjoy grooving to. No Son of Mine and Jesus He Knows Me are fun, very accessible, but at the end of the day, they're still pretty fun. I do like the fact that this album has some of the longer suites on here. Driving the Last Spike has some really interesting hooks. It almost feels a little bit like Domino, as well as the Fading Lights. I love how this song closes off with that dun, 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 dun. It almost sounds like fashion television from like City TV, if any of you guys are, you know, Torontonians such as myself, and you know that track like that. Dun, 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 dun. It still kind of has that a little bit, like it's very early 90s. And even with some songs like Dreaming While You Sleep, a little bit longer, it's in the 7 minutes, so at least they're trying a little bit with, you know, to please the classical Genesis fans on here. And they do work. Now, unfortunately, there still is some not so great tracks. Hold On to My Heart is just a snooze fest. You can tell that Phil Collins is really putting in his smooth pop era, and it's not quite jiving with the rest of the boys. So those hits are still an enjoyable time, and it got me through listening to this album, at least overall. Like, I can listen to this full album and skip only a few tracks. Paint your face all white. Okay, so their first album, From Genesis to Revelations. I understand why people love this album because it is very different, and this really shows, even from the beginning, Genesis never had a problem with going accessible, because a lot of these songs are like the very late 60s accessible rock at the time. And for me, I guess there's just not a whole lot of songs to really grab onto and enjoy. Like, it is one of the albums that I'm least familiar with. I still listen to it from time to time, like Where the Sour Turns to Sweet, In the Beginning, The Silent Sun. These guys were quite good, but also the songs were very short, very succinct. Overall, it has a very great unified feel, but it just didn't really connect with me. There wasn't that reason that I fell into Genesis, like those soaring soundscapes, the complex time signatures, you know, the longer stretches of music that really get you into it. All that is gone. But unlike another album that I'm going to be talking about shortly, this album, it didn't have any hooks, and I think that's where it falls for me. Okay, so full-on disclosure, I do have a soft spot in my heart for this album. I love Invisible Touch for a few of the songs on here. Land of Confusion and Invisible Touch are actually, they're pretty fun. Like, if Genesis were to follow the template of Invisible Touch and Land of Confusion, I wouldn't be so hard on them for albums like Abacab and Calling All Stations, and even We Cant Dance, because they're fun. It's very danceable as well, which is another advantage to this. But there's also a few tracks on this album that really devalue it. Tonight, 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 In Too Deep, Anything She Does, and Throwing It All Away. Snooze fests. But what raises it for me, as I said, Invisible Touch, Land of Confusion, even Domino parts 1 and 2. Like, I love part 2 of Domino, where we've got that like that driving force. It just gets into me, and I can't help but just gush along with it. But the one that really puts this over the edge for me is the Brazilian. I love this track. I friggin' love this track, and I wish that this track got more of the recognition it deserves. True, it is just a purely instrumental, and it does kind of follow suit with Domino Part 2, but I just, when it gets in, it's just like wow, 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 wow. I can't help but be like, yes! So that's what really put it so high for me on this. So why does it always seem to be looking at you? So after Abacab, they put out their self-titled work in 1983, and this held the two ideologies of Genesis in their hands, and they kind of looked at both ones. The first side holds much more of a succinct Genesis, where it's Mama, Home by the Sea, as well as That's All. And so this presented more of like the radio-friendly aspect, like Mama you could hear on a radio station, and it's almost like In the Air Tonight Part 2, because it follows the same kind of sequence where it's dark, it takes its time to really develop, and once you get to that plateau, it really hits it home. And Home by the Sea has that same kind of aspect that a lot of other tracks later on will have. Like, this was the template that they used for Domino, the Fading Lights. So, you know, they spent the first half of the track really developing the song in more of like an accessible format, and then a play out, a beautiful play out. And That's All is kind of like the radio single from the band. And if they continued that, where it was like that very kind of jam session, very fun atmosphere with a radio top 10 that's, again, accessible, fun, grooving along, danceable, I would be fine. Unfortunately, it's also the second side, where it's a lot more of just like the straight up singles, like Illegal Alien, Take It In All Too Hard, Just a Job to Do, and It's Going to Get Better. These guys, that can't be said for one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs of Silver Rainbow. Man, I love this song. Much like the Brazilian, this is a track that I cannot get enough of, and this is why I love Genesis, like what they're able to do with the harmonizations and the approach with Silver Rainbow. It's, Now, true, this album really overuses the drum machines, and I know at the time Phil was doing a lot less on the drumming just because of his wrists and whatnot, which is totally fair, but it also undermines the brilliance of Phil Collins' drumming. And then there were three. So this is the departure of Stephen Hackett from guitars, and Hackett's departure is felt on this album. Now, that being said, there are still brilliant movements, and I feel like this album has been overlooked. Like, it's definitely the transition album from their very proggy 70s albums to their very fun poppy albums of the 80s. And they were trying different things, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't. It was still very complex, but very succinct as well. Like, I think the longest track on this is Burning Rope at the 7-minute mark. And I love Burning Rope. I love how it downplays into a minor key and then switches and then upplays in a major chord. And each song told a very brilliant and very beautiful story. That's something that we kind of lost along the way. Like, we still had a number of fairy tales and a lot of like actual stories, but that's why we fell in love with Genesis. And this was kind of the last of all those. Like, once they put out Follow You, Follow Me being the closing track, they really started their hand in love ballads and accessible top 40 songs where the subject matter of the song was very, very shallow. Some people liked that, some people didn't, but this was kind of that last little effort that they put out. It holds a very special place in my heart, so yeah, loved it. So in some respects, Trespass was the one that put them on the stage, like put them forefront. This had Anthony Phillips on the main guitars, and can never remember who it was that was on drums. I probably should have looked that up before I started this, but anyway, this has some beautiful moments. This is where they really started to experiment in terms of the longer stretching, getting more into a symphonic progressive rock forefront. This is where we get more of a story, more of a fairy tale aspect. Visions of Angels, one of my favorite songs from these guys, as it really just, it plateaus and it climaxes so many times that I'm just And it also has, I mean, one of their staple songs, Of the Knife, and I love the get up and go aspects of this. And yeah, great effort.
There must be some misunderstanding.
So in my mind, Duke is the perfect Genesis album in the fact that it's balanced the poppy accessibleness with the progressive rock aspect. And I really wish they stayed the course and made the Duke Suite the full one-side track, like starting it off with Behind the Lines, Duchess, guide vocals being countered with, I think, Turn It On Again, and then finally Duke's Travels and Duke's Ends being one full side of music, kind of similar to how Supper's Ready is. But instead they chopped up the song and they scattered it throughout the album, and I don't know, it's a little bit of a disappointment in that fact. But this whole suite of music is a masterpiece. It is full on a masterpiece. It's accessible, it's fun, it's complex, it has ebb and flow, and it grooves along, and it provides such a great identity. And even some of the more fun tracks on this, Misunderstanding and Turning It On Again being those radio-friendly play styles, I really enjoy these two tracks. They're very fun, they're very accessible. Unfortunately, some of the tracks on here are also a little bit on the snooze fest kind of side. Alone Tonight, Please Don't Ask, and Cul-de-sac. It just goes to show how great the Duke Suite is to make me forget about those guys and really elevate the rest of the album. So we're kind of bouncing all over the place, but we're starting to come into in my mind, the classic Genesis era, and we start that off with the next album of Nursery Crimes. It's a very divisive album. Like, I know it took the band quite a bit of time to actually write and record. A lot of people say that the first side is far superior to the second side, and they're not 100% wrong, but I think a lot of the songs from the second side get overlooked, and it might just be the presentation of how the songs were laid out. Obviously, the musical box, For Absent Friends, and Return of the Giant Hogweed, staple tracks, and I love the fact that they really handed the reins over to the two new faces on the album, right? Phil Collins and Stephen Hackett just joined the group, and they're like, yeah, go write your own song. We'll let you sing and play your own little ditty to follow up the musical box. What could possibly go wrong? And I'm just like, damn. Like, that's how you initiate new members, by allowing them their own space on the album right after such a masterpiece that is the musical box. Now, enough has been talked about the musical box and the Return of the Giant Hogweed. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the second side. Seven Stones. I love the Mellotron at the end. It's such a great build-up. Harold the Barreled, some of the drumming on this, just dripping with brilliance. I think this album, like this side, should have started with Harley Quinn, gone into Harold the Barreled, gone into Seven Stones, and then ended with Fountain of Cinematics. because of there's a little bit more of an ebb and flow in that sense. I think starting it off with this, it doesn't quite flow quite as much, and I think that's part of the reason why this is downplayed a little bit more. But the epic of the fountain, I love the fairy tale aspect of this. I love the aspect of Hermaphrodite. This is something that was revisited later on within the cinema show, but just the jam session and the playing of the guitar and keyboards, whew. I could see that this album was a little bit of a struggle with the band, but it was still a great payoff. Wind and Weathering is just a great time. There are a few things on this album that I'm not quite on board with. Your Own Special Way, not a big fan. Not a big fan. Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers, and In That Quiet Earth, as well as Afterglow, the 3 final tracks on this. So great, so fun. One for the Vine. I freaking love that song. It is so powerful within the story, within the presentation, and within the music. This album does get overlooked because it does follow up with such a brilliant album, but I can't help but love it. It is a little bit overreaching at times, and it is a task to sit down and listen to. There's a lot of fluff on this, but overall, as terms of a concept, it works. The fluff actually works, and I love how deeper into the music you go, the more unsure it is. And I love the relationship that I've had with this album, because I've had a very deep relationship with this album. When I first listened to it, I only listened to the first album. When I was in my mid-20s, 10 years with this album, I only listened to the second album. Now, I'm loving both. Like, the first album is definitely a lot more accessible. It has a lot more of the standout tracks, like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, In the Cage, Carpet Crawlers, Back in New York City. All of these guys are very, like, radio-friendly, very accessible. The second album, though, holds a lot more of the experimental and very progressive stuff. The Colony of Slippermen, Anyways, Lily White Lilith. Waiting Room is one of my favorite tracks because it really solidified that chaotic resolution. And the overall story, I still have no idea what's going on, but that's half of the fun. It's only because the other 2 albums have a little bit more perch on them. But the relationship that I've had with this album, it warrants a conversation. There's a few reasons why I put this one at, I guess this is the third album of theirs. Yeah, Getting Them Out by Friday is still a very strange song for me, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it just doesn't. And half the time I find myself skipping the song, and it really kind of devalues the album a little bit. The rest of the songs, masterpieces. Timetable, Watch Where the Skies, Can Unity, Horizons, and Supper's Ready. I mean, I could do a whole video about Supper's Ready all on its own, but this album holds another really personal spot with me. Watch Where the Skies being one of the very dark songs, Horizon being a very light song, so I like that contrast of how each side starts. I love this album, but yeah, Get 'Em Out by Friday is still one that I'm a little iffy about.
They got no horns and they got no tail.
Trick of the Tail, okay, so when Peter Gabriel left this band in 1975, I was concerned. I was very shooken up. Can't tell. I swear, I'm like a 50-year-old trapped in a 30-year-old's body. No, but really, when I found out that Peter Gabriel left the band and that they had continued on, I was just like, I don't know. And I know a lot of people were like, can they do this without Peter Gabriel? Trick of the Tail proves they could, and they could do it very well. Trick of the Tail is like, it's a full-on masterpiece. There's no bad song on this album. Like, all of the albums up to this point had one song, maybe 2, and in some cases the full album, but songs that I was lukewarm with at best. And that's why Trick of the Tail for me is like a full-on masterpiece, and why it's number 2, because each song is a masterpiece. Each song is dripping with brilliance. I love that each song is paired with a foil. Like Dance on a Volcano is paired with Entangled, Squawk is paired with Mad Mad Moon, Robbery, Assault and Battery is paired with Ripples, and it ends off with Trick of the Tail and Los Endos. So good. Okay, so what's number 1? Again, process of an elimination. We already know it's...
Can you tell me where my country lies?
Selling England by the Pound. This was the first album that I fell in love with, like full on, full board, fell in love with. I've talked at length about this album. It was my first Masterpiece Theater. It was my first live stream, so I've talked at nauseum about this album. I'll just leave it with, it was the album that changed my life. So that's my worst to best of Genesis. What did you guys think? How would you rate Genesis's albums? Let me know of your own ranking by commenting down below. I know my list is going to be different than yours, and I encourage that. Let me know of how your rank would be by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys, as always, are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.